Figures in the Woods New Year's Eve has always been a weird holiday for me. Some years are full of parties and laughter, others are quiet and uneventful. But in 2017, I experienced something that still keeps me up at night. I was flying home to Ohio after finishing my semester at the University of Rochester. My flight had been delayed, throwing off all my family's plans. Originally, we were supposed to drive together to my cousin's house for a New Year's Eve party, but because of the delay, my parents left without me, taking the main car. That left me with our spare vehicle and one companion, our golden retriever, Vera. By the time my Uber dropped me off from the airport, it was already past 10. I barely unpacked before tossing my bags in the car, grabbing Vera, locking up the house, and heading off into the cold Ohio night. The drive was nothing special, just empty back roads, dark fields, and occasional patches of forest. The sky was black, the only light coming from my headlights and the scattered glow of farmhouse porches in the distance. About halfway through the drive, Vera started whining in the passenger seat. At first, I thought she was just restless, but then she began pacing. That's when I realized she needed to go. I groaned, knowing I had no choice but to pull over. The next clearing I found was small, barely big enough for the car. I stepped out, stuffing my hands into my pockets, shivering in the freezing air. The world was silent. Not a single car had passed in miles. Vera, however, didn't seem to care. She trotted to the tree line, sniffing around in the snow. I watched her, feeling an odd sense of unease settle in my gut. There was something about the stillness that felt wrong. And then I heard it. A loud crashing sound echoed from deep within the woods. It wasn't the snap of a twig or the rustling of a small animal. No, this was heavy, deliberate. It sounded like something big moving through the trees. My breath caught in my throat, and before I could even process what was happening, Vera bolted. She sprinted straight into the trees, disappearing into the blackness. I shouted her name, over and over, my voice breaking the eerie silence, but she didn't come back. That's when my heart really started racing. I didn't want to think about what she was chasing. My mind kept cycling through rational explanations. A deer, maybe a coyote. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I had no choice. I took a deep breath and ran in after her. The only light I had was my dim phone flashlight and the thin layer of snow on the ground. Every step felt like I was running blindly into darkness, branches whipping against my jacket. I called for Vera again, desperation creeping into my voice. Nothing. I ran until my lungs burned, the cold air searing my throat. Then, suddenly, I saw her. Vera was crouched low, trembling, her tail tucked so tightly between her legs it was practically pinned to her stomach. She was slowly walking toward me, her body rigid with fear. I dropped to my knees, grabbing her by the collar. She was shaking. I had never seen her like that before. And then, it hit me. We were still out here. Something was out here. I needed to get us back to the car. I yanked her leash, whispering for her to stay close. She obeyed, too well. She clung to my side like she was as desperate to get out of there as I was. Then, from somewhere behind us, the crashing started again. But this time it was moving, following us. I didn't think, I just ran. Vera darted ahead, leading the way. I chased after her, my legs burning, my breath coming in frantic bursts. I could hear whatever it was behind me, keeping pace, crashing through the branches. We burst out of the woods, and I nearly sobbed in relief when I saw my car. I threw the door open and shoved Vera inside before slamming it shut behind me. I scrambled into the driver's seat, fumbling with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the ignition. And then, before speeding off, I made the mistake of looking up. At the edge of the woods, 3 figures were standing there, watching. They were just silhouettes against the darkness, but they were tall, motionless, and something about them was just wrong. I felt pure, raw terror surge through my body. I jammed the car into drive and floored it. I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. It wasn't until I had driven miles away that I realized Vera was bleeding. My stomach dropped when I saw the cut just below her shoulder blade, deep enough to stain her golden fur dark red. I nearly slammed on the brakes. Something had cut her. I scrambled for the first aid kit in the trunk, my fingers numb as I cleaned the wound. I wrapped it in gauze, whispering over and over, "You're okay, you're okay." I had been in shock before, but now I was terrified. By the time I got to my cousin's house, Vera had calmed down, but I couldn't stop shaking. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell my relatives. I don't know why. I just felt like it was something I needed to keep to myself. Because deep down, I knew. If I told them, if I said it out loud, I'd have to accept what really happened that night. That something was out there, and that it wasn't human. Wrong turn. New Year's Eve should have been simple. Just a straightforward drive through upstate Pennsylvania to visit my parents. I had been looking forward to the time alone. A long drive through the quiet, wintry roads always gave me a chance to clear my mind. But that night, I realized that the worst dangers don't always come from the road itself. The snow started about an hour into my drive. At first, it was light, just soft flurries dusting the windshield. But the further I drove, the heavier it became. Soon, the world outside was nothing but a wall of white. My sedan wasn't built for winter storms, and when I felt the tires start to slide, I knew I had to pull over. I found a spot on the shoulder, far enough from the highway to avoid any passing cars. Not that there were many. I texted my parents to let them know I was stuck and would wait out the storm. They were worried, but I reassured them I'd call for help if it got too bad. I hated the idea of spending the night in my car, but it seemed like my only option. An hour passed. The snow didn't let up. If anything, it got worse. I turned the engine on and off in short bursts, trying to keep warm while conserving gas. The isolation of it all was starting to set in. The silence, the emptiness. And then I saw the headlights. A pair of high beams cut through the snow, getting closer. I could hardly believe my luck. A snowplow pulled up beside me, its orange lights flashing. I had never been so happy to see a truck in my life. The driver rolled down his window. He was older, maybe late 50s, with a weathered face that looked like it had endured decades of harsh conditions. He wore a thick jacket and a black knit hat pulled low over his ears. But something about him felt off. He just stared at me for a long moment. Then, finally, in a gruff voice, he asked, "You all right?" I nodded quickly, explaining that my car couldn't handle the road conditions. He listened, then let his eyes drift toward the back seat of my car. It wasn't a glance. It was a scan, like he was checking for something. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. "I can give you a ride." I hesitated. I didn't know him, but the idea of sitting in my freezing car all night wasn't much better. And he was a plow driver, right? Just doing his job? Still, something about the situation made me uneasy. "You sure you can take me all the way to my parents' place?" I asked. He nodded. "Yeah, no problem." I hesitated again. "What about my car?" He shrugged. "Just leave it." The way he said it made my skin crawl. But after a long pause, I grabbed my bag, locked my car, and climbed into the passenger seat. At first, the warmth of the truck's cab was comforting. I could feel my body start to relax, but then I thought maybe I was overreacting. My GPS still showed us heading in the general direction of my parents' town. Maybe he actually did know a shortcut. But then I started noticing things. Empty liquor bottles rolling around the floor, crumbled maps stuffed into the side pockets, and then a knife wedged between the seats. My pulse spiked. I suddenly became hyper-aware of everything. The way his fingers gripped the wheel, the way his breathing changed when I shifted in my seat, the way he kept missing turns, forcing my GPS to recalibrate again and again. He wasn't lost. He wasn't taking me home. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady. "I think we missed a turn." He didn't answer, just kept driving. I needed to get out. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A house. A single house, the first I had seen for miles. And something in my gut told me it was my only chance. I waited. My hands were shaking. I reached for the door handle as quietly as I could. Then, as we got closer, I kicked the door open and jumped. The freezing air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I hit the ground hard, my legs screaming in pain, but I scrambled to my feet and sprinted toward the house. Behind me, the truck skidded to a stop. I heard the door swing open. Then, he shouted something. I didn't turn around. I just ran. I pounded on the house door, screaming for help. A moment later, it swung open, and an older couple pulled me inside. I nearly collapsed onto their floor. I tried to explain what happened between gasping for breath. They didn't question it. They locked the door and called the police. By the time the cops arrived, the snowplow was gone. They searched the area, but found nothing. They told me they'd keep an eye out for him. But in a storm like that, finding him would be almost impossible. A few hours later, an officer gave me a ride to my parents' house. I was still in shock, still trying to wrap my head around how close I had come. When I finally got to my parents' house, my dad was furious that I hadn't called the police sooner. I didn't tell him the whole story. I just said I got a bad feeling. But deep down, I knew. If I hadn't jumped out when I did, I might never have made it home at all. Frozen deception. Every winter, my friends and I had a tradition, heading out to an isolated lake deep in the woods to ice fish. There was something about the silence, the frozen air, and the stillness of it all that made it the perfect way to close out the year. No crowds, no parties, just us and the ice. This year, it was me, Luke, and Darren. We were all used to the routine: pack up the truck, load the gear, and head to our favorite spot. The lake we fished at wasn't well known, which was why we liked it. It wasn't on any maps, and unless you knew exactly where to go, you'd never find it. That night, we left just after sunset. The snow-covered roads twisted through the dense forest, our headlights the only light cutting through the darkness. Luke was driving, gripping the wheel tight as the tires crunched over the frozen path. The forecast had called for a clear night, but the cold was brutal. When we pulled up to the trailhead, something immediately felt off. A truck was already there, a black, beat-up pickup sitting just beyond the entrance to the trail. That was unusual. This lake was too far off the beaten path for random visitors. Then we saw him, a man, bundled in heavy winter gear, standing near the edge of the trees. He wasn't moving, just watching us. We obeyed. Every step felt surreal, like we were in some kind of nightmare. The only sound was the crunch of our boots in the snow. When we reached the trailhead, one of the men climbed into Luke's truck. He revved the engine, grinned at us through the window, then sped off into the night. The others backed away into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. We stood there, our breath fogging in the freezing air, shivering. Luke was seething, clenching his fists so tight his knuckles were turning white. Darren looked like he was in shock. Then, Luke pulled his phone out of his boot. I stared at him, my heart pounding. He had lied when they asked for our phones. He had hidden it. Without hesitation, he called the cops. His voice was furious, rattled.